I am Brooke Clement, and it is my pleasure as director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum to welcome you to this evening's virtual exhibit opening, Women in Uniform. This exhibit is now open to the public at the museum in Grand Rapids, and it will be on display through May 6th. COVID protocols and details for ticket purchases can be found on the Library and Museum's website. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from both the Director of Naval History, in addition to the head curator of the Navy Art Collection from the U.S. Navy's History and Heritage Command. There will be an opportunity to ask questions of our presenters at the end of the program, and to do so, please use the Q&A box located on your screen. Rear Admiral Samuel J. Cox, U.S. Navy retired, serves as the Director of Naval History as well as the Curator of the U.S. Navy. He is responsible for the Navy's museums, art and artifact collections, the research library, 150 million pages of archives, and for collecting and interpreting U.S. naval history throughout the world. Director Cox graduated with distinction from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1980, winning the Trident Scholar Prize for his independent research project, U.S. Foreign Policy and Naval Strategy in China, 1945 through 1950, as well as the prize for the history major with the highest standing. Director Cox also holds a master's degree in military art and sciences from the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, earning the U.S. Army designation as a military historian. In his 37-year naval career, Director Cox served as an intelligence officer, retiring in November 2013 as the Senior Naval Intelligence Community Leader and from both command of the Office of Naval Intelligence and as Director of the National Maritime Intelligence and Integration Office. On December 29, 2014, he became the 14th Director and Curator of the Navy. Director Cox's awards include the Bronze Star, the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal, as well as numerous other military unit, campaign, and individual medals. Following Director Cox's presentation, we will hear from Gale Munro. Ms. Munro has worked at the Navy Art Collection since October 1989, being appointed head curator in 1997. Before that, she worked at the Smithsonian Institution and the Army Center of Military History. She has more than 40 years of federal service, her first position being a summer hire at the Comptroller of the Currency Library in the Ford administration in 1976. A native of Washington, D.C., Ms. Munro earned an MA in American History from the University of Maryland in 1989. Please join me in welcoming Director Cox and Head Curator Munro to our virtual stage.
Hey, it's an honor for me to be able to speak tonight. My intent is to give a short history of women in the Navy, since that's what I know about the Navy. When I first went to the Naval Academy in 1976, I was actually surprised to discover that I was in the first class that had women in it for the class of 1980. And it came with quite a bit of controversy at the time, revolving around the Academy's mission was to prepare midshipmen morally, mentally, and physically to be combat officers in the U.S. Navy. And the combat exclusion for women, which was a matter of law, was still in effect. So the result was a pretty difficult transition. And my greatest respect goes to those women who came in with my class and went on to break incredible new ground despite a lot of adversity. And that theme is actually of adversity goes back all the way to the beginning of women, in the Navy. There have been women on ships going back to the beginning of the Navy, but generally a handful, usually disguised as men, but no one in the active service role. One of the first women to actually operate in command aboard a ship was actually Harriet Tubman during the Civil War, African-American former slave who led 150 African-American soldiers on a raid on 3 Union Navy gunboats deep into plantation country and released 700 slaves. but she wasn't, in the Navy. Uh, Later on in the Civil War, the Navy created a hospital ship on the Mississippi River that was staffed by volunteer nuns, and also several African American escaped slaves, women, were hired as boys to assist the nuns as acting as nurses, but none of them were actually in the Navy per se. And then after the Civil War, there was nothing until the formation of the Navy Nurse Corps in 1908. And they weren't actually in the Navy either. They were essentially akin to a contract civilian employee of the Navy. But 1908 was their foundation. Um, and then the big impetus for bringing women in the Navy the first time was the outbreak of World War One. And even before the start of the war, Navy leaders figured that the Navy was going to go in a major expansion if we went into war. And in fact, the 1916 Naval Appropriations Act, dramatically expanded the Navy. It turned out that the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, in the Wilson administration, was known for progressivism as long as it involved white people. He was actually a staunch segregationist, so nothing he did benefited African Americans. But he looked at the 1916 law and saw that there was nothing in it that said he couldn't bring women into the Navy, the Naval Reserve, which had been established by that law. So about 2 weeks before President Wilson declared war, the Navy actually started recruiting women to come in and serve in the Navy. This met with considerable resistance, both in the formation of the policy and even afterwards. But the result was during World War I, 11,000 women came into the Navy. Most of them were in a branch that was called the Yeoman F. Sometimes it was called Yeomanettes, but that wasn't the official designation. It was a yeoman, and the F stood for female. And they did a lot of, mostly clerical work, but some worked in intelligence, some worked in munitions factories, and they freed up men to go forward into ships. In fact, for every one woman they brought in, they sent two men forward, which is an indication of the better efficiency of the women. Uh, and it actually worked really great. There was considerable challenges, but the women performed extremely well, far beyond the expectations of many of the doubters. And the senior Navy officials were quite pleased. However, when the war ended, it's like, whoop, no need for women anymore. And within a matter of months, almost all of them had been demobilized and sent home. Then with a struggle to get the benefits of their male counterparts, which eventually they got, but not very easily. So the Nurse Corps continued throughout all of this. A number of them and number of the yeomanettes died of the Spanish influenza during the war. That was the biggest source of casualties among the women. But in about 1923, the first women actually went aboard ships as nurses on board a hospital ship, Relief. But that was it. World War II breaks out in December of 1941 for the Americans when we're attacked. And it takes until July of 1942 before President Roosevelt approves the establishment of the Naval Reserve for Women, also more popular known as the WAVES, or Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service. And that turned out to be a significant number of up to 86,000 women in the WAVES served during World War II. Again, almost entirely clerical work or nurses. Some of the nurses became what was called flight nurses, and one of them actually was on Iwo Jima while the fighting was still going on, which may have been the first Navy woman to actually be in a combat zone. Again, when that war ended, there was quick demobilization of most of the Navy, to be honest, but almost all of the women. But the women had performed so well that senior Navy leaders were looking for a way to get a new law passed that would allow women to serve continuously. And they succeeded under the Truman administration in 1948 with the Women's Service Integration Act. There came with restrictions. The women couldn't be more than 2% of the force. They couldn't have more than 106, which Navy is a captain and Army is a colonel, Air Force is a colonel. And they were still barred from serving in any kind of combat. And that's essentially how it continued until the late Vietnam era, when Admiral Zumwalt became the chief of naval operations and did some major shakeups of the Navy, both in the terms of race relations, but also women relations, and started the process of opening up a lot more opportunities for women. And this again provoked backlash. There was considerable controversy. It was a tough uphill fight for the women to get these more advanced positions. But the big breaking point, as difficult it was getting the women into the service academies. Being able to be officers from the academy gave them, some credibility that they didn't have before. And since then, it's been pretty steady progress up until now. It actually continues now. More in 1994, the combat exclusion rule was waived, so women could serve on combat ships. So they started going on, aircraft carriers and amphibious ships, and not just tenders and hospital ships. And by the mid 2000s, some of the women had moved up in the ranks and were entering very responsible senior positions, to the point where we had, Admiral Michelle Howard was the first African-American 4-star, the vice chief of naval operations, and then the commander of U.S. naval forces in Europe. And also Vice Admiral Nora Tyson, who was the first woman to actually command an aircraft carrier battle group. And today we have Captain Bauer Schmidt, who is actually the first woman to command an actual aircraft carrier, and she's currently on deployment, now. So in 2016, all the parts of the Navy were opened up, including submarines, including SEALs, if you could qualify. Submarines, women have qualified. SEALs, they're still in support roles. I don't know that there's any women actually qualified SEALs yet, but the opportunity is there. So most of this progress has occurred in only the last 40 years out of the last 240 of the Navy, and it's a credit to the capability of the women who went through some of those challenges, and then in crisis and combat have proved themselves. We've lost several on the coal and in Iraq and Afghanistan. So they serve the same way with the same sacrifice and risk as the men do, and they've excelled. So that's the history of women in the Navy in a nutshell. At this point, I hand it off to Gale Munro, who's our senior art curator, who's been around for quite a long time, as you do, and she is indeed a fount of extraordinary expertise. And I think you'll find what she has to say quite interesting. So thank you.
You've just heard about how women have been integrated into the Navy, but now I'd like to tell you how art has been integrated into the Navy. A lot of people think of it as an oxymoron. It is not. There are days when I think naval intelligence is an oxymoron, and that's not one either. But we're going to focus on Navy art depicting women in the collection. The quick and dirty answer is there are many ways that art has come into the Navy, but there are some milestones that are worth noting. Of course, what we know today as the Navy Art Collection is a combination of two collections that grew up in the Navy. First, when President John Adams ordered the creation of the Navy Department Library in 1800, his instructions were to include charts and images that would be useful for the Navy's development. The library still holds an 1824 ledger book, which lists some of its early acquisitions, and on the flyleaf is a list of the earliest paintings that they acquired. which were portraits of the founding fathers and early naval heroes, some executed by John Wesley Jarvis. We no longer have these paintings. Some or all of them are at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, though it's been rumored that some were given to the Library of Congress. Actually, I think most, if not all of them, are at the Naval Academy. The second part of the collection is often referred to as the combat art collection. That's probably what we are more famous for. That's sending out artists into forward areas, sometimes combat zones, to observe Navy activities, battles, Navy personnel at work, and creating artwork based on what the artists see. All the services have had combat artists at various times, though we each do it in our own way. The Navy credits the founding of our combat art program to artist Griffith Bailey Cole. Cole was a well-connected society artist, muralist, actually, in New York City, and believed in many did in 1941 that war was imminent. And he had been impressed by the British war art program in World War I, and he wanted to make sure that United States artists would be on the scene for what was coming. He tried and failed to get a meeting with President Roosevelt, but met Admiral Chester Nimitz at a Naval Academy football game and arranged a meeting with him to pitch his idea. Nimitz liked the idea, and he gave Cole connections within the Navy, and the combat art section was soon formed in the Bureau of Public Affairs, and Cole was its first artist. There are other art programs associated with the Navy, and we'll talk about those as we come to them. For our purposes, I'm putting the artworks that I'm showing you now in date order, more or less, though there are different ways you can sequence the art in this exhibit. We're going to digress into the background of the creation of these artworks as we go. Now, you will note I'm starting off with a printed item, which is a poster. Navy art collection. We think of ourselves as collecting the visual culture of the Navy, so we just don't stick to paintings and sculpture. We collect printed matter, other matter. There are some places where we don't stray, which is like fiber art. We don't do that because the different department has better storage for that sort of thing. But here we have a poster from World War I called "What the Navy is Doing, Join the Hospital Corps." And though recruiting posters were used in the military way back to the Revolutionary War, they were just occasional printings until World War I, which happened to coincide with the golden age of illustration and improvements in color printing processes. Various offices of the government took advantage, and massive printings of posters resulted. One series of posters that started in World War I and continued into the 1920s was the "What the Navy is Doing" series. These posters usually feature a photograph with an informational paragraph. Today, we love them because they show you little slices of history that you don't always find in a book. This one is "Join the Hospital Corps." This is actually a recruiting poster for men. Women weren't accepted into the hospital corps until World War II, but as you can see in this World War I poster, women are present. Women could serve in the Navy Nurse Corps, but they served without rank as supernumeraries, as the Admiral said, like contract workers or excess personnel. And from the pictures, you can see that what they're doing is anything but excess. So I sat and I thought, why put women in these pictures at all? And my conclusion is that their presence conveys a level of caring that a group of exclusively men wouldn't convey. You can draw your own conclusions, but that's what I think. Let's see, let me try and move on. Um, Here's a picture of a Yeoman F in her uniform. It was painted just after World War I, but the artist herself was a Yeoman F during the war in Washington, D.C., and though we know this is not a self-portrait. The Navy commissioned this painting in 1925, back when such things were possible, for an exhibit of Navy uniforms at the Sesquicentennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1926. In the following year, the artist opened an art school in DC, which she ran with her husband until the 1950s. Well, we've already noted that the combat art section began in 1941. Griffith Bailey Cole quickly proved its worth when he was an eyewitness to the sinking of the Reuben James, did some drawings which were immediately published, very popular, informed the public. The worth of the combat art section was proven. There were soon 6 artists, and by the end of the war, there were 8. These artists were sent to every part of the globe and some stateside locations with the goal of producing artwork that could be used to publicize the war effort. The press was heavily censored in World War II, and dramatic images of the war effort were popular. The paintings and drawings, as we see in this case, were published in magazines and loaned to exhibits. Thus, from that effort, we traced the start of our traveling exhibit program, and actually until, about 2 years ago, we still had some of those World War II crates that we used to ship our exhibits. We've since replaced them. This is by Dwight Shepler. He was a New England artist, Massachusetts specifically, but before the war, he focused his art on skiing and sailing, and after the war, he actually went back to that. He was one of the earliest recruits to the combat art section and traveled widely. He was at the Battle of Guadalcanal, and after some time in the studio, went to England to cover the invasion preparations and went ashore at Normandy. He turned in this particular drawing at the end of the war with a group of miscellaneous items, so we're not really sure exactly where he saw this scene, though I know he visited a number of bases. My best guess is that he drew this locally in New England. When he was between his deployments, he was allowed to work in his personal studio, though like modern remote workers, he occasionally had to go to a base to turn in forms, paperwork, or receive messages. Most of the combat artists wrote their own captions, which we try to use today as much as possible. So when you're in the gallery at the museum and you read the caption, those are Shepler's very own words. Let me pause for a moment and tell you how the combat artists work. It still carries through to today. They carried some of their art materials and a camera with them, and when they were in combat areas, and someone usually handed them a gun or a light weapon when they were going over the side of a ship on an invasion. We don't do that part today. They usually did their sketching and quick works on the scene, and after some time in the field, came back to the States to complete more finished works. Because space was short in Washington, they were allowed to work from their home studios between assignments. When they were on ships, because they were junior officers, they stood watches just like every other junior officer. This is a Navy nurse. Very well, let me tell you her story. At the start of this is by Albert Murray. Before the war, he was already a noted portrait artist. So before he was sent off on any combat art assignments, he was first tasked with painting some of the early war heroes, and in this case, heroine. Ann Bernatitis at the start of the war was serving in a US Navy hospital in the Philippines. She and other Army nurses continued to treat patients during the sieges of Bataan and Corregidor. But when Corregidor fell, Bernatitis was one of a group that was evacuated on the submarine USS Spearfish. She immediately became a symbol of heroism of military nurses. Murray was assigned to paint this portrait, and it appeared in the media many times and in exhibits. Back in those days, museums were also trying to get into the patriotic mood by showing assemblages, sometimes of combat art. The National Gallery here in Washington, D.C., which at that time was known as the Mellon Gallery, and the Metropolitan in New York had a display of combat art paintings, and this one was included in those shows. Moving on from the works of the combat art section, we're going to look at artwork created by the Abbott Laboratories Artist Program. The story of this program, as it has been passed on to me, is that at the beginning of the war, Abbott Labs was making huge profits from sulfa-drugs penicillin at a time when it was considered unseemly to make huge profits from the war effort. Go figure. As a way to show support for the war effort and to use some of the profits for the public good, and because the Abbott family was keenly interested in art, they partnered with Associated American Artists, which was an organization that included some of the most successful artists in the country, and they've also partnered with the U.S. military. Abbott paid the artist expenses, and the military allowed them to accompany military units at home and abroad. Frequently, but not always, they focused on medical topics. Some of the most famous artists in our collection come from this group. Thomas Hart Benton is one, though he did not do any pictures of women, so he is not included in this show. This is a picture by painting, very small one, you'll see it, of a Navy nurse in a hospital at New Caledonia. This is a painting of women doing medical art at a Navy hospital stateside by Carlos Anderson. And one not medical is Bomber Glamour by Howard Baer. This was either painted at Naval Station Anacostia or Naval Station Norman, Oklahoma. We're not entirely sure. Anacostia, of course, is near and dear to us because it's just across the river from the Washington Navy Yard where we work. The third group of World War II artists represented in this show were the recruiting bureau artists. Even during the war, they were occasionally confused with combat artists, but the combat art section was very touchy about recruiting poster artists being called combat artists. And there are nasty notes in the file about people making that mistake. There were 17 naval districts, and each one had its own recruiting poster division. John Falter is the artist of this painting. He had done many Saturday Evening Post covers, not quite as many as Norman Rockwell, but I think he was a near rival of Rockwell. But John Falter was specifically hired by the recruiting poster division in Washington to work on posters to recruit waves. At the end of the war, the artists were demobilized, and in our files, we have some memos debating about what was going to happen to the artwork. Eventually, it was decided that the combat art would remain with the Office of Public Affairs, which eventually evolved into the Chief of Information, or CHINFO, as we call it today. The Abbott artists had worked for all the services, and in the end, Abbott divided up the collections, gave the artwork to what they deemed to be the appropriate services, and what came to the Navy ended up with the combat art section. Most of the recruiting bureau art was returned to the artists. It had been used to publish posters, and they figured they didn't need it anymore. And that's why it keeps turning up at auction. As a matter of fact, there's 2 that are about to come to auction next month. For unknown reasons to us, some of Falter's Waves art got left behind and came to the Naval Historical Center, which is now the Naval History and Heritage Command, came to us fairly soon after the war. The art programs demobilized with the rest of the service. They tried, well, there were 3 artists during the Korean War, though there are no pictures of women from that war because the 3 artists were in combat zone constantly. They never went to a hospital or anything. They were always under fire, it seems, or on a ship that was shooting. So there are no Korean War pictures in this one. After the Korean War, the combat art went into hiatus. The idea was revived a few years later, late 1950s, and it was largely championed by a civilian artist, George Gray, who is a member of the Salmagundi Club in New York City. That's an artist club. Gray worked with the Chief of Information to develop short-term travel opportunities for members of his club, and eventually to include the West Coast. They reached out to Holly House, which was a West Coast Arts Club. The artists went on invitational travel orders at the Navy's expense from the early 1960s to the time the program died out in the early 1980s due to lack of funding. They traveled to every corner of the globe, including the Arctic and Antarctic. The name of the program was, okay, we pronounce the acronym NACAL, N-A-C-A-L. That means Navy Artist Cooperation and Liaison. I still don't understand it, but that's what it is. Anyway, each NACAL assignment had to have a goal. And since it was an era when women's roles in the military were expanding as well, assignments highlighting that were included. This is from one of the NACAL trips. Alice DiCaprio. The NACAL program came to an end in the early 1980s as funding ran out. But as I like to think, the idea of documentation of art had become so normal that it, in the ensuing years, it wasn't a matter of whether there would be artists, but where they would come from. Here's one that came to us. This is from the Bosnian War. Welcome to Sarajevo. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, our artists tended to be active reservists. These were reservists who just, for the lack of a better term, they got noticed. And once they got noticed, they got activated, and somebody came up with money to send them somewhere. Monica Allen Perrin was one of these, terrific artist. She lives in France now, I think. But she went to Sarajevo first, and later on, we had her going to Desert Shield and Storm. Like NACAL, there had been occasional invitational travel orders. During Bosnia, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, we had 3 reserve officers, that's Monica, who managed to connect with public affair units and go into action for us. Then, just a fluke, in the 1990s, I had a couple of enlisted guys assigned to the art gallery to be picture framers. They were draftsmen, and goodness knows they were both exceptionally talented artists. They came one after the other, but there was a little overlap in between. So I tend to think of them together. But this was Eric Murray, African-American gentleman who was keenly concerned for the lack of art depicting African-Americans in the collection. He did something to help us, and I was able to come up with some travel money and sent him off to a few other places, and he did a really iconic modern picture of USS Constitution under sail, which, you know, most of the time it's stuck in the Pentagon. It's in somebody's office because it's such a nice painting. Anyway, I love Eric's work. I need to move on. Anyway, this is a painting by Morgan Wilbur. He is one of my current artists. I have two artists currently. Morgan came to us, I think he first started working for us when he was the art editor of Naval Aviation News in the late 1990s. And eventually his billet was moved over to us, and we've been sending him traveling whenever we can. Since then, he's been to Iraq and Afghanistan. This is a picture of a female Seabee in Afghanistan during the global war on terror. Let's see, hold on. Okay, here is one of my other civilian artists, formerly one of my civilian artists. This is by Christopher J. Battles. Chris is now the artist in residence for the Marine Corps, and a gentleman named Doug Rowe has taken his place, who is also a terrific artist. But we sent Chris to a couple of battle groups, and he was on a ship wandering around, and he happened to walk into this welding shop, and lo and behold, it was run by 3 women, which, I don't know, it still seems rather extraordinary. But he did this painting. He did a couple other paintings of the women working on the ships that he visited. You know, I love Navy art, and I hope you do too. We are moving on just as best as we can, and we're going to keep documenting women as long as we can. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Gail. That was very interesting, and I'm certainly looking forward to seeing the art in person as well. So we're just a reminder that we are taking questions at this time, and to do so, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to get some of your questions answered here. So Gail, it sounds like you do a lot of commissioned works, but is that the only way that you gather or collect art, or are there various avenues that you use?
No, there are various avenues. We take donations like any museum, tax deductible, but also decommissioning ships, closing bases. You know, guys on ships will pick up paintings in the oddest places. And if it's like ship's property, when it decommissions, usually it will come to us. Also, sponsors' gifts are frequently paintings, frequently a portrait of the ship when ships are commissioned. And when it's decommissioned, if the sponsor does not want it back, I mean, they're allowed a token gift back from the ship. We get whatever if they don't want it. Let's see, decommissioning ship, closing bases, lots of stuff have come from closing bases. And then I have my 2 combat artists, or official artists, if you prefer, since we're not at war right now.
Well, that's interesting. Like, do you also, like, know that the portraiture and the paintings, those are considered artifacts as, you know, but I'm just wondering if there's other 3-dimensional artifacts within the collection.
We do have some sculpture, but we mostly have busts and small items in our storage. My storage, if you saw it, is not geared towards 3 dimensions. So there is a great big warehouse for three-dimensional artifacts down at Richmond, and oversized sculpture, if they're not on a permanent site elsewhere, they end up down at Richmond.
Okay. I do have a question as to whether there's a specific piece of art that seems to be the most requested. Like, I'm just curious as to what you have in collection that might be, heavily requested for loan or for just to view.
Sure. The most famous painting in our collection is very controversial. Visit our website, www.history.navy.mil. But it's Paul Cadmus, The Fleet Sin. It is a painting that the government tried to censor. I forget, it's 1932 or 1934. It was part of the Public Works of Art projects creations. It was sent to their big public exhibition at the Corcoran Gallery here in Washington. But before the show opened, the painting was yanked out of the gallery, actually carried off by the Navy Department. Henry Latrobe Roosevelt, the president's cousin, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, carried it away, and it was not publicly seen until the early 1980s. Through his auspices, it ended up at the Alibi Club here in Washington, which is a private men's club. It hung over the fireplace there until the early 1980s. And the complaint about the painting was, go look at it, is that it did not depict the Navy in a favorable light. It's some sailors on shore leave, hanging out with some floozies, other questionable characters, engaging in non-Navy behavior.
I see.
We have it now. It was recovered in the 1980s, and we have it now. It travels a lot. As a matter of fact, I believe it's at Crystal Bridges right now.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So is there more art that's not within this exhibit that depicts current women leaders in the Navy, or is that still in process?
Yeah, I'm going to have to update the show at some point, because both Chris Battles, before he left us, and my new artist, Doug Rowe, have been painting images of Navy women, both at work and also just more formalized portraits, bringing the history forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, one final question from me before we turn it over to Cleves, but is the Naval Museum located, is it in Anacostia, or is that, and then, or is the public able to come and view the materials at the Naval Museum?
The Navy Museum is on the Washington Navy Yard,
Okay.
and the public is allowed on the base. Be careful. I'm not sure of their hours. Tell you, I don't work in that building, so I'm sorry I don't keep up with it. I don't think they're open on Sundays. But we do have a little gallery over there, and just about every painting on the wall in all the exhibits are our paintings as well. If there's something that's in storage and you want to arrange with us ahead of time and come on a weekday when we're in the office, anything that is on site is potentially viewable.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Gale and Admiral Cox. And I'm going to turn it over to Cleves. We're really grateful for your attendance and presentations here today.
Yes, thank you, Admiral Cox and Gale Munro, for terrific presentations to open our exhibit, Women in Uniform. I know our audience learned a lot. I know I sure did. I'm Cleves Whitney, Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and we are proud to partner with the Ford Presidential Library and Museum to bring you these innovative exhibits like Women in Uniform, as well as insightful speakers like Admiral Cox and Gale Munro, whom we heard this evening. You know, programs like this evening's are what make the Ford a truly special place. If your mind was enriched by this evening's presentation, if your perspective was challenged, if you changed your mind about something, then we hosted a successful program, and we hope that you will become a friend of Ford. To sign up, please visit our website at geraldrfordfoundation.org. That's geraldrfordfoundation.org. There you will find an array of resources to learn more about our 38th president, a lot of homework helpers for kids who are doing papers on President and Mrs. Ford, and wonderful explanations of past programs, objects in the museum, and finding aids for the archive. You'll learn about the 38th president and his times, and especially you'll learn about virtue-anchored leadership, which is very much needed in our present challenging times. So please consider joining us in the important work we do. Thank you and good night.